Of Pokemon's many status conditions, today we are going over Burn, and we are starting with Gen 1. Now, Gen 1 Burn is basically Gen 7 and Gen 8 Burn, so it does the whole attack halving thing from the beginning, but it only does 6.25% per turn, which is Sand Chip, if you want to picture it that way. So, while it generally gets the job in the higher power metagames of Gen 7 and Gen 8, not just higher power, but more passive damage, in Gen 1, Burn is generally considered not very... In fact, you actively don't want to burn the opponent, simply because Sleep and Freeze and Paralysis are all so powerful. I mean, even if Sleep Clause is active, then Paralysis, or even if Sleep and Freeze Clause is active, then Paralysis is so powerful that burning Starmie or an Alakazam or a Chansey generally is not a good idea, because you are more effectively able to force KOs through Paralysis, through the turns that they're going to lose 25% of the time. That's how you get the KOs, by attacking them, not by sitting around and waiting for 6.25% to accumulate. I mean, theoretically, yes, in recent years, players have been exploring such options because it prevents Chansey from sitting on you forever and those long, drawn-out, prolonged stall wars. But overall, Burn has been viewed as negative in Gen 1 because, you know, you can't, I mean, even if without the freeze, then you can't paralyze something. And Recover has 32 PP, so it's going to take a lot of turns for Burn to, you know, wear down Starmie and Alakazam. I mean, yes, in conjunction with attacks, and this is kind of why it's been sort of reevaluated in recent years. But you don't want to just go around, you know, looking to distribute burns. You know, in newer gens, you fire off a Scald or a Will-O-Wisp or a Lava Plume, and you're like, I'll burn whatever comes in, I don't care. And in Gen 1, you kind of don't want to go throwing around burns because, oh, well, you know, now that I can't paralyze or threaten to freeze or sleep that Chansey, it just became a lot more threatening. I mean, a burned, if you throw around a burn before you got a sleep off, then suddenly that Alakazam or Starmie or Chansey that you burned becomes a perfect sleep blocker. So, the other statuses are far superior to Burn in Gen 1. And that's why it was not seen for a long time. However, it did start... Oh, and the biggest part of not wanting to look for burns in Gen 1 is that if you use a fire move on a frozen Pokemon, you of course thaw it. And in Gen 1, then if you freeze an opposing Pokemon, it will not thaw out unless you use Haze, which there's no use for, or a fire move on it. So... yeah, that's not... Oh, and another big thing that's Gen 1 exclusive is that in this generation, Fire Blast has a 30% chance to burn, which is insane and would be absolutely ridiculous in any other gen, but in this one it's pretty contained. So, why did Fire Blast start getting used? You know, what was it that made people think, hey, this burn thing might not be so bad after all? Well, the burn thing is similar to Toxic, if you've watched my video on Toxic, and if you haven't, then go check that out. But, you know, the other statuses, you know, I realize I didn't mention every other status because I left Toxic or Poison out. But it's the same thing, you know, it doesn't do enough in the... Given how long these games go, then Burn doesn't do as much as Paralysis will, most of the time. What you can do to make Burn work for you is... make it stack. Well, there are two ways. So with Moltres, then the reason you use Fire Blast is because it hits incredibly hard. It hits as hard as Articuno's Blizzard, meaning that it is tied for the strongest special attack in the game, even stronger than Mewtwo's Psychic. So that's pretty... You're slamming neutral targets really hard. You're 2-KOing Tauros, you know, you're slamming Snorlax for huge chunks, and most Pokemon do not resist it. And one of the Pokemon that does resist it, Rhydon, does not want to switch in because it still takes a lot, and the burn rate will ruin it. Now, the Pokemon that... In fact, it hits pretty much everything besides Chansey and Starmie really hard. So, what happens when you burn Chansey or Starmie? Well, you actually make that work to your advantage, because Moltres also has Fire Spin. And if you know what Wrap does in RBY, then... you know where this is going. And if you don't, then basically it's a partial trapping move. So what you do is, instead of like making the opponent forced to stay in for 2 to 5 turns and doing like little bits of damage to them, then instead, if they stay in, they just can't move. And it's a very controversial move, but that's, you know, another video. But basically, the drawback to Wrap and Clamp and Fire Spin is that they do very, very little damage at any given turn. It's like increments of 2 to 3%. And if you're trying to hit multiple Fire Spins, because, you know, one T-Wave and you're done for, with 70% accuracy, that's really not good. So, if you're trying to, and Fire Spin also doesn't have very good PP, I believe. Yeah, only, so that's what, 24 with PP max. So, you will not, even if you Agility to outspeed Starmie, which you will, and Agility is great, but we'll get to that. But even if you outspeed Starmie and you naturally outspeed Chansey, you are not going to break through them with, you know, Fire Spin doing 2 to 3% to them at a time. But if you burn them, then you might, because suddenly 2 or 3% becomes, you know, 8 to 9% per turn, and suddenly, I mean, if you've seen Jirachi flinch things in any tier, you know how deadly 8 or 9% can be. I mean, you obviously don't try to beat them from full, that would be ridiculous. But if you were to, you know, weaken them first, which is a normal expectation because you want to do that for your other Pokemon like Tauros anyway, and then they're suddenly hanging out around, you know, half health and they're burned, then suddenly they're going to have a hard time beating you, especially because it's not like you have to Fire Spin them to 0%. You just have to put them in Hyper Beam or even Fire Blast range. So Moltres hits them very hard, and it takes setup. You got to be careful with Moltres, but it makes Fire Blast an actually viable move, because if it just kind of had to be, you had to rethink how you looked at it, because before it was, oh, I can't afford to burn that Chansey or Starmie. Now it's, I want to burn that Chansey or Starmie so I can take advantage of it with Moltres later in the game. I mean, maybe Moltres is probably just always a little underrated, especially because how physically bulky it is, and one-on-one against Tauros. It's great. I mean, it's weak to Blizzard in this gen, which is another reason why Moltres is, you know, has to watch out about actually eating attacks. But you turn burning things into a positive. Now, obviously, you don't put Moltres on a team that's spamming Ice Beam from turn 1. You know, you're not going to lead Jinx and have Ice Beam Chansey and Blizzard Starmie and Lapras and, you know, look for freezes all game long only to send out a Moltres. Works on a very different kind of team. But it has helped make burn a legitimate thing in RBY, for lack of a better term that popped in my head. So, yes, burn is now used as a good weapon on specific teams, of course, but I mean, a lot of good things are only used on specific teams. So, the other burn user is Tauros. So, what Fire Blast does on Tauros is, traditionally, in the standard Tauros war, where you go Body Slam, it's Slam, Slam, Beam to 3-KO the other Tauros. And it's one of the truest 50-50s in all Pokemon, because of how often Tauros, or RBY games come down to Tauros Wars. So, sometimes to improve their odds, then players will throw in a Blizzard, you know, Slam, Blizz, Beam, or Blizz, Blizz, Beam, or some mixture, so to, you know, throw that opportunity for a freeze in there. So what Fire Blast does is, it's you know, a very tiny chance of coming out on top, but it's still a chance. What Fire Blast does, it doesn't really skyrocket your odds, and I mean, the accuracy is lower than Blizzard's by 5%, but the 30% burn rate is really good. So it does give you a tangible advantage in the most significant one-on-one in the tier. And, you know, Tauros dropping Earthquake, which happens more and more as Tauros like turns to Thunderbolt for Cloisters and Slowbros and stuff. But yes, when Tauros doesn't have Earthquake, then it gets exploited by Gengar sometimes. But most of the time, then you are just loving the fact that you can Fire Blast that opposing Tauros. Now, obviously, Fire Blast is not a very spammable move for Tauros. It's not like you get it in on a sleeping Pokemon and your first instinct is to Fire Blast that fully healthy Snorlax. No, you want to Body Slam. That's what makes Tauros so threatening. But in that one-on-one, the most crucial of all the one-on-ones, then you are really, really happy that you have it. Obviously, it can backfire, but I mean, it's that's just the game you play sometimes. I mean, just like Slam Slam Beam isn't always going to win it for you. It's the true 50%. And to go above 50% in that crucial matchup is really big. So that's burn and RBY. Obviously, you have to be careful with Fire Blast Tauros. I wouldn't want to make any statement as strong as you shouldn't have Fire Blast Tauros on a Freeze Focus team, because you still probably can, but especially because you're not always going to be spamming Fire Blast with Tauros. It's not like Moltres, but you still really want to be careful. It's, you know, if there's a frozen Pokemon on the opponent's team, you know, maybe it's not like they're going to switch the frozen Pokemon into the Tauros Horn necessarily. If the Tauros is fresh and they just want to at least exchange a Slam before getting out, then maybe you can lead off with a Fire Blast, but afterwards, probably exercise caution. Again, this is just a very vague overlook of that. I mean, the Tauros War and the very it would also deserve its own video, but to have that advantage in situations where you're not going to let it backfire on you is immense. So that's Gen 1. We'll move on to Gen 2. So in Gen 2, Fire Blast was lower, had its burn rate lowered, so it went from 30% to 10%. So with 8 PP in Gen like GSC, which has longevity and PP stalling, then you're not getting anywhere with looking for Fire Blast burns with, you know, 8 PP and 85 accuracy. Put it this way, even in Ubers, then Ho-Oh Sacred Fire burn spam doesn't really work, because of all the rests and the heal bells, and again because it only has 8 PP. So that fishing for burns is not really a strategy in GSC, so this section is going to be pretty short. The only time you really see burns being fished for in GSC is on flamethrower variants of Snorlax. They generally play the long game and they prefer flamethrower, so they can consistently, you know, threaten Skarmory, not make it so they only have 8 chances to hit it and then they're walled forever. With a flamethrower, then they can chip away at Skarmory without worrying, and in addition to the accuracy and high PP, then they also are able to look for burns in longer games. Now this is not what most people look for immediately, but it is a nice benefit if you're looking for some way to break through, make progress. You know, if that Gengar is switching into you all game, then if you burn it, then, you know, good night. And this is why rest ghosts, Gengar and Missy, are really valuable. And so, you know, even if Snorlax gets a burn, that's not necessarily the end. But if you are in that long game against that restless Golem or T-Tar or Gengar, then going for a burn can potentially be, you know, really, really nasty. But it's still not seen very often. And yeah, there are stray burns sometimes, because Fire Blast is used commonly. I mean, Gengar uses Fire Punch, and, you know, Machamp and Marowak can use Fire Blast, and Nidoking can use Flamethrower Fire Blast, and Moltres is used sometimes. T-Tar sometimes uses Flamethrower Fire Blast. So yeah, stray burns happen, but that's an oddity, and it's not really going to impact a game as commonly or as much even, because chances are that the Pokemon hit with the burn has rest. Like if T-Tar Fire Blasts into Suicune and gets a burn, then so Suicune has to rest a few turns earlier. Not that that can't be big, but it's nothing that happens commonly. The only time you really see burn used actively, this is still super rare, but I wanted to mention it because it's awesome, is on Sacred Fire Smeargle. Now, Smeargle is not a longevity-centered Pokemon, and the reason you use Sacred Fire, so the reason it has Sacred Fire, or the fire coverage rather, is for Fortress, because when you're a spiker, you want to ideally be able to do something with spinners, and with Sacred Fire, then you go from being, you know, set up fodder for, you know, totally taken advantage of by Fortress. You know, it can spike, it can spin, and with Sacred Fire, you turn the tables and you hit it for good damage and you burn it. So that's really, really big. Fear, I believe, is the first person to have brought this to a tournament, so major props. And in general, it's nice because burn is a very instant status. Another Gen 2 burn change is that it now does 12.5%. So, you know, neutral stealth rock hit, if you want to conceptualize it like that. So, yeah, that's... Sorry, someone just messaged me on Discord after I told them not to. Anyway, so yeah, Sacred Fire, Ruins Fortress, and in general, just a good move. Smeargle's moveset is very flexible, and if you can, you know, get a burn on the T-Tar or something that can come in, that's really great. I mean, Toxicking or T-Waving are also nice, but burns are... Oh, it ruins Golem if you can get it there. And just generally good chip damage for Smeargle's teammates to take advantage of. So, one of a good option for Smeargle if you are going to use it, you know, with a Miracle Berry, which is Gen 2 Lum. So, yeah, this is the only time you'll ever see someone really actively using a move dedicated solely for burns. I mean, it's for coverage, but it's also just to spread burns. So, yeah, that's Gen 2 burn. Pretty simple. Move on to Gen 3, and this is a big one because, number 1, Will-O-Wisp enters the picture. Number 2, well, I guess Flame Body exists now, but, you know, no one's using Mag Cargo. As great as it would be to switch into something like a Double Edge or a Gengar Ice Punch, it's gimmicky, so no one's using Flame Body. But Will-O-Wisp exists, and there's also a ton of passive damage now. So Spikes has 3 layers, Sandstorm is permanent and is everywhere, and there's even stuff like improved Toxic, improved Leech Seed, so it's obviously you don't stack Burn and Toxic, but passive damage is everywhere, and Burn becomes a part of that. You can't Toxic Steels, but you can burn Steels. You can't burn Fire types, but you can burn you can Toxic them. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So, yeah, Will-O-Wisp is a pretty big deal. No, it is a huge deal. If a team does not have an answer to Will-O-Wisp Gengar, it is a bad team. End of story. There are no two ways about it. Now, what that answer to Will-O-Wisp Gengar is can vary. You know, it's not like you are forced to run Houndoom or you're Will-O-Wisp Gengar weak, and even then it can still use Focus Punch. So, you're never fully safe against Gengar, which is why it's so good. But it is still and yes, the accuracy is bad, but we're not going to get into that. The reason why Gengar is not completely overbearing is because it's not unbreakable, and it doesn't have superb bulk or longevity. It wants to avoid taking hits as much as possible, and it's not like burns are automatic KOs. However, there is a reason why the most classic style of advance over the past decade has been get up Spikes and Sand and then spam Will-O-Wisp with Gengar. And this is the reason why Will-O-Wisp is such a powerful move is not just because it stacks with the passive damage so well, but because it's so easy to use, because you hit everything. In Gen 4, there's no Magic Guard, there's very few Fire type. There's, you know, the Water Veil Pokemon is Wailord, which has a niche, but it's not switching into Gengar because it gets destroyed by Thunderbolt. And even sets without Thunderbolt, you know, just Giga Drain or HP Grass. So yeah, Wailord is not a Gengar switch-in. So the options for actually switching into Burn are nasty. I mean, Natural Cure is a good option for Burn because it makes Gengar have to use the move over and over, as opposed to, you know, so if you switch Blissey or Celebi into Will-O-Wisp, then they're not burned permanently, which is really helpful, both for when they next switch into Gengar, because it has to use the move again, and both for their other matchups as well. But even that's annoying because when you use Will-O-Wisp, you are, assuming it hits, then that's 12.5% right there. And that's incredible with all the other passive damage in the tier. It adds up really fast, and obviously the attack ruining part is amazing. I mean, the physical attackers like T-Tar and Metagross, I mean, being able to Will-O-Wisp them, that's pretty amazing. I mean, one of the reasons why Heracross is such a threatening physical attacker is because Will-O-Wisp doesn't stop it. It does guts. So yeah, Wisp is pretty immense. Now, there are viable Fire types in the tier. They have become more common over the past half-decade or so. I have a video dedicated to the Fire types of Advance. I'm always looking for an opportunity to plug. But, I mean, it does really cover that. And there are a couple, but Gengar remains dominant because the Fire types are not really great Gengar switch-ins. I mean, it's nice to have some respite against Will-O-Wisp, for sure. If you can switch Moltres into Wisp and then bring in your Celebi on the T-Bolt, then that's less damage than if you had been burned on the switch with Celebi. But, you know, there's still not great switch-ins to Gengar one-on-one. And matter of fact, I believe Will-O-Wisp Gengar needs Thunderbolt because otherwise you are letting yourself get walled by Moltres and Charizard, and those can't be removed forcibly by Dugtrio or anything. So, yeah, Wisp Gengar is stupid spammable, and it's really powerful. So, it has become one of the tier's most defining Pokemon, and there's really no two ways of... You can't skimp on it, or you will just lose very, very hard. So, lots of passive damage, spammable, and, I mean, even the Pokemon that can absorb it are still kind of playing a dangerous game. I mean, you can try and absorb it with Moltres, or you can and then pivot around, or you can, you know, absorb it with a Natural Cure and only take minimal damage and make it use it again. But it's still passive damage, and it racks up. And I have a video on that too. You can check out the power of passive damage for further details. But yeah, Willows Gengar is endlessly flexible and powerful and spammable and useful and consistent and amazing. The most inconsistent thing about it is Will-O-Wisp accuracy, but I mean, that's Pokemon. So, yeah, Wisp hits everything. See, look at OU. The only fire type is Moltres. Everything else gets hit. And, I mean, you have some other stuff in the lower tiers that's not switching into Gengar safely. So, yeah, we have one of the exceptions on the Wisp list, but yeah. So, here's Moltres. Another thing about Will-O-Wisp in Gen 3 is that it is not a TM, much to the disappointment of many. So, it is not learned by every fire type. As great as it would be if Charizard learned Will-O-Wisp, it does not have it. Neither does something like Camerupt. If Camerupt got Will-O-Wisp, that would be really good. Camerupt is one of the few Pokemon able to truly switch into Gengar because it is neutral to Ice Punch, immune to Thunderbolt, and immune to Thunderbolt. So, like in terms of a true Gengar counter, then Camerupt is it. But Camerupt has a ton of flaws. It's slow and it's frail and very vulnerable to spikes and Dugtrio. So, yeah. That's why Gengar is such a big deal. Even its counters, or its checks are very few, and even its checks aren't super safe. So yeah, the next most popular Will-O-Wisp spammer is an actual fire type, Moltres, because it gets it through Pokemon XD, I believe. So with Moltres, then it's a similar story. The easier part is that Gengar has Thunderbolt for something like Milotic that would want to absorb it and refresh it off. But with Moltres, then Milotic started running Refresh simply because it makes it a pure Moltres answer. So you wisp off you refresh off the Wisp and you're fine. Now it's not unbreakable, of course. Moltres can that's why Will-O-Wisp is so good. So even if your answer is Refresh Milotic, if they're Sand Up, then Burn 12.5, and then if you force Milotic out immediately, then it's coming in at 87.5 the next time, and suddenly HP Grass is looking meaty, especially if you're modest. So, yeah, Wisp can cause all sorts of havoc. And the other thing that makes Moltres so threatening is that, unlike Gengar, it has a very powerful stab move, whether it's Flamethrower or Overheat. You switch into Metagross, which is already amazing, and you threaten it out for an Oko, incredible. And what are the Pokemon that want to switch into Will-O-Wisp most of the time, or want to switch into a fire move? Alright, let's look at the tiers resists. Arrow, we'll skip over Blissey for now. Arrow, Flygon, Gara, Milo we already covered. Salamence, Starmie, good answer, sure. Suicune, Swampert, T-Tar. So yeah, most of these are getting ruined by HP Grass, or, you guessed it, Will-O-Wisp. I mean, Salamence would be a great answer, pretty good, or at least pretty good, if it wasn't fearing getting wisped and totally ruined. Would be great, but like a Wisps or a Wish set, for example, would be a pretty reliable Moltres answer. But I mean, you pair this powerful Fire Stab and Will-O-Wisp and Sand and Spikes, and you have an absolute monster on your hands. So it gets a lot of opportunities to come in and fire them off. Now, Will-O-Wisp is not mandatory on Moltres. It's not mandatory on Gengar either, although most of the time you do see it on Gengar. But Moltres doesn't need it because it's so offensively powerful that you just want to be attacking a lot of the time. And you do actually like using multiple fire moves. Both Flamethrower and Overheat definitely have use on the same set. And sometimes you like stuff like Protect or Roar. But Will-O-Wisp is a big part of what makes it such a pain. I mean, T-Tar would be a very good answer. But, with Will-O-Wisp, then not so much. I mean, Will-O-Wisp even annoys something like Suicune. And where, I mean, the most perfect answer is Milotic and Blissey. And Will-O-Wisp can even help Moltres bypass them, because it lets it play the long game, and Moltres gets a lot of opportunities because, there's a lot of Steel types and, Celebi in this tier. And, when Skarmory's around every corner, then not only does Moltres have a great partner, but it's also going to be coming in against the opposing Skarmory and firing off its attacks and its Will-O-Wisp. So, yeah, Wisp is hard to deal with from Gengar and from Moltres. Now, it's not as oppressive from Weezing, who's still a very good Pokemon in its own right. Mainly because you can actually absorb it with Moltres or something like a Charizard pretty easily. But if there's no it's Will-O-Wisp still, and that's the whole idea, that there aren't many fire types here, so most of the time when you have a Will-O-Wisp with Weezing, you are doing 12.5 to something. The least you're doing, besides a miss, is you're doing 6.25 because you hit something because there's no sand and it has leftovers. Or you burned a sand immune Pokemon and it has leftovers as well. Yeah, but still, that's really not bad, especially with you know, the lack of natural cure. I mean, there are no sand immune natural cure Pokemon, unless I just completely forgot everything I knew about the tier. But no, there aren't. So yeah, it's a pretty nasty move to switch into. And another big change for Burn in Gen 3 is that Rest and Sleep Talk, or Sleep Talk no longer calls Rest and was eventually found out to not be very good at all. So Sleep Talk is at an all-time low, and once that was discovered, that Sleep Talk is actually can prevent you from waking up if you use it before you burn sleep turns, or before you wake up. Then that made Willows Gengar usage shoot through the roof, and then Moltres followed, and I mean, Weezing was rediscovered. So yeah, Wisp, it's harder to shrug off burns. Like in the GSC section, we talked about, oh well, even if you do manage to burn something, it might not matter because so many things have Rest and Sleep Talk, and there's even some Heal Bell. Well, I'll start off by saying that Heal Bells are pretty rare in GSE, but, you know, fair point. It's still rare in Gen 3, but the fact is, not only is there very little Rest Talk, I mean, there's some, you know, sometimes Zapdos or Suicune, but still not great to be forced into resting to shrug off the burn. And, you know, there's not as much Rest Sleep Talk, and if they're Rest without Sleep Talk, then they're forced to rest and not do anything for 2 turns. So, yeah, this is why Burn in Gen 3 is such a big deal, because it's so spammable just with Will-O-Wisp. So, and of course, it's not just like your Gengar or your Weezing is just a Will-O-Wisp machine. They have other moves. I mean, you can have a Heal Bell Blissey or Celebi, but then Gengar taunts you and goodbye. You know, Weezing is taunt as well. It can lure those Pokemon in and explode, just like Gengar can. So, yeah, Will-O-Wisp is such a great move in its own right, and the fact that it's not even, you know, if you could have a move that just froze on command, like Will-O-Wisp but for freeze, then you would definitely use Pokemon that had that move. And the worst part about it would be that there's still Pokemon besides that. I mean, if they're truly awful, yeah, obviously, you would want to use that, but Weezing, yeah, no one's using Will-O-Wisp coughing. But Weezing, I don't even know if coughing learns. I assume it does. Well, it can't do it by TM, but in this gen. Anyway, so yeah, point being, Will-O-Wisp makes things happen by itself, and not to say nothing of the environment you're surrounding it with, being sand and spikes, maybe even Leech Seed. Knock off Hariyama. Oh my god, so there's not even lefties to go around? Oh, yikes. And then the rest of your moveset can be tailored to make it even nastier. You know, whether Weezing goes for a more offensive approach or a more defensive approach, it complements it nicely. And yeah, being walled by Moltres kind of, you know, not great, but you can even turn that to your advantage. If you have a Weezing offense team, you probably don't like switching into Moltres, right? Because nothing likes switching into Moltres. Even defensive teams don't like switching into Moltres. So teams with less of defensive integrity than a defensive team are definitely not going to like switching into Moltres. So when you have that opportunity to force Moltres in, because that team with a Moltres, when you're facing Weezing, they're not going to go, oh, let me go to this other Pokemon to, you know, get burned, where I can just throw my Moltres into it and not get burnt and threaten in return. And Weezing kind of wants you to, if Moltres is going to come in, it better be on Weezing because you can explode and take it out. Now, obviously, there's a lot of mind games on both sides of that, but the basic idea is you can even turn that, I mean, we already kind of touched on this with the Gengar section, but or with the explosion section rather, but you can even turn the opposing player's response to Will-O-Wisp to your advantage because they're kind of forced to go into it or they're going to get ruined by burn. And with Gengar, this could even be something like double switching to Dugtrio, which is a very nasty tactic, but often works. But yeah, just luring Moltres in and blowing it up is also great. Now, I'm going to take one of my patented bathroom breaks, and when I return, we'll quickly go over Houndoom and then move on to Gen 4. Alright, so, the last of, there are, other Pokemon that can technically Will-O-Wisp in Gen 3, like, Dusclops, and, I think Gardevoir is very cool, but we're not going to go over all of them, we're just going to go over the biggest ones, and even including Houndoom is kind of a stretch, because Houndoom has a lot of moves it wants to run, so it can't always fit Will-O-Wisp, but the fact, and it's not the most durable of Pokemon, so it's not like you get a ton of opportunities to spam it, but it's still a great move, and it still sees plenty of usage on Houndoom. So, it's pretty simple. Will-O-Wisp is a good move, and it prevents stuff like Mence and Arrow and T-Tar from switching into you, and just passive damage is great in general, so it's... Yeah, that's pretty much it for Houndoom. Houndoom is, of course, great because it is one of the few Pokemon that can absorb Wisp. It even has Flash Fire, but generally prefers Early Bird for dumb stuff like Hypnosis Gengar, because it doesn't really need the Flash Fire boost. So the last move, Crunch, HP Grass, Roar, stuff. So, with Will-O-Wisp, then you eat... It's like a better version... Well, it needs a lot of bulk, but the idea behind Pursuit Tar is you're running a Pokemon... Well, you're running T-Tar, but you also use it to... use it to pursue Gengar, and you basically say, I don't mind my T-Tar burned if it's going to be all special, and if I get to Pursuit Gengar out of it. And with Houndoom, then you don't use T-Tar for that purpose, probably because you want to use T-Tar for something else, and you basically get to not even get burned by the Gengar, and you get to pursue it with an even stronger stab pursuit, because Houndoom has 10 more base special attack than T-Tar, which is a pretty big chunk, especially when Spadef Gengars EV themselves for T-Tar. So, yeah, that's Houndoom. Not much, but again, its niche is more, in relation to Burn, it's definitely more on the side of absorbing Burn than dishing it out, but it can dish it out. Now, in terms of absorbing Burn, then, we'll quickly go over some of the options. I mean, Natural Cure Blissey is a great one, Celebi, and not a lot of other great options, so it can be tough. I mean, I've used stuff like Rest Flygon before, so to kind of have some help against Moltres, and it's generally a good option. Rest Gyarados, the favorite of UD. Most of the Will-O-Wisp is coming from Gengar, so if you can use Guts Heracross or Lum on stuff like Metagross and T-Tar, that really helps. Doesn't always work against Moltres, but it can. So then there's Refresh Milotic. That's a great one against Moltres, pretty much ideal, but very exploitable by the likes of Weezing if you're totally reliant on it. But that's what makes Weezing and Gengar to some extent good if you're talking about dealing with Blissey and Celebi. And yeah, then there's Moltres itself, which is a pretty good absorber against itself, but you also, and Charizard to a lesser extent, but that one-on-one, that Moltres mirror is kind of awkward, so it's more of a pivot than anything else. Then, I mean, a lot of the time you'll see teams forced to switch into Moltres with something like a mixed Salamence if they're not relying on Brick Break damage, because it's still threatening with Dragon Claw and Fire Blast. It's still far from ideal, but one of the most ideal options for Will-O-Wisp absorbing from the likes of Moltres is Starmie, because it's faster, has Natural Cure, so it doesn't have to actively get rid of its burn, it just switches out. And it's got 32 PP to recover, just like Milotic. So, but it's not an immovable answer. HP Grass does hit it really hard, a lot harder than Milotic. So it's good, but not a hard counter by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, things like Suicune are effective, but when you're forced to rest, that's very, very exploitable. And again, Starmie and Suicune are not exactly great absorbers against the most common Will-O-Wisp user, Gengar. So then you have stuff like Refresh Swampert trying to help the cause a little bit. It can definitely help out, but it shouldn't be your only answer. And then there's the likes of T-Tar, who just stomachs the burn and trucks on because T-Tar can do it all. T-Tar can do nothing and set up sand and still be immeasurably important. And then like a Calm Res Zapdos can help, but again, you can't be purely relying on walling and rests. Just because they're dealing passive damage does not mean that these Will-O-Wisp Pokemon cannot really ruin your life. Like, if you're relying on resting and heal belling and natural curing forever, then they are going to punish you for it. You have to be able to punish them back. Withstanding the burn isn't about withstanding the burn permanently. It's about withstanding it so you don't collapse and so you are able to fire back. So, and you have Charizard, who's like Moltres, basically, and then we already mentioned how Camerupt is kind of... I mean, I want it to be good, but it's not. So, we move on to Gen 4. So, a big one here, Heatran, Will-O-Wisp Absorber Supreme, and you don't want to give this thing Flash Fire. And it has burn moves of its own. Well, another big thing about Gen 4 in terms of burn is that Will-O-Wisp becomes a TM, so like everything gets it. And, well, not everything, but a lot of things get it. And, I mean, we can just look up Will-O-Wisp now. And, Infernape doesn't really use it. And, oh, but in general, you have things like Gallade using it. That's a very cool Pokemon, by the way, Will-O-Wisp, Gallade. Makes it even harder to answer. You have, you know, every Miss Maggie, or whereas Miss Dravis didn't learn it in Gen 3, then I don't think anyway. But everything learns it, basically. Every fire type, so now Charizard has it. So yeah, Heatran has Will-O-Wisp if it wants, and it used to be a lot more popular pre-Clefable. But that's another one of the developments in the anti-burn thing. But before that, what else does burn have? Oh, well, you know, you don't even have to go out of your way to include spikes anymore, because as great as they are, spikes in Gen 3 are not mandatory. So most burn teams would, you know, love to have spikes, but, you know, you can't always fit. You know, not every Will-O-Wisp Gengar team has spikes. Most of them do, not all of them do. Same with something like a weather-clearing Moltres team, although in that case, then Will-O-Wisp is more an utility move than a passive damage spreader if you're trying to get rid of the sun. But, offensive Weezing teams, that's a much better example, actually. So they're usually not going to be able to fit in spikes, almost rarely, or almost never, in fact. Now, in Gen 4, every team has to have Stealth Rock, and so your burns are automatically getting, you know, a bit of a push. So that's pretty incredible. So, and to make it even better, you don't even have to use Will-O-Wisp now. You can attack and still potentially burn the opponent with 30% likelihood thanks to Lava Plume. Now, Lava Plume is not a widely distributed move, and there is technically some use for Camera Up in OU, but, you know, not a lot of other Pokemon are, you know, have access to it. It's like Entei, you know, cool, but nah, and like Flareon and stuff, but, you know, not really gonna use them in OU, sadly. But Heatran, perfect Lava Plume user, and burning, it's just like Moltres in the previous generation, because, yeah, you can switch Gyarados or Swampert or Tyranitar into it, but, you know, a burn is kind of real bad news for them, and now it can do it without even having to use Will-O-Wisp. Now, obviously, it has lower power than Flamethrower, but it's not really being used for the power, so Lava Plume can be used on all sorts of sets, and it, of course, pairs beautifully with none other than Protect. You don't need Lava Plume and Protect together, but they're almost never seen without one another. And you can throw in other things like Sub, or Earth Power, Roar, Stealth Rock, Explosion, Taunt, whatever you need. Toxic used to be popular. So in terms of anti-burn options, we have other burn users to get to, but that's the thing about Heatran. It is both the burn distributor and the burn absorber. Like when Rotom has a free Will-O-Wisp, then Heatran makes it not so free and in fact punishes it with Flash Fire. Because before we said, you know, Houndoom doesn't really need the Flash Fire boost. Well, Heatran doesn't need it, but it sure makes it annoying to switch into when your Flygon comes in and takes 60% from Fire Blast. So, even when it's not, you know, looking for burns itself. So, yeah, Heatran is my music? Yes, just keep playing, please. So, and in terms of other Will-O-Wisp absorbers, what else do we have? Well, we still have the Natural Cures, Rests, or Sleep Talk is good, but still not ideal. Rest Talk is still not very popular by any stretch of the imagination, and the most popular Rest Talker in Rotom is not exactly keen on absorbing burns from Heatran. So, yeah, burn is still quite annoying, and the Will-O-Wisp Rotom can be sometimes absorbed by Poison Heal Breloom, but that's still rare. The biggest change was when Clefable became OU, and I have a video on that too. But yeah, so before Heatran was just the biggest pain to switch into. It's like, how do I absorb a burn from this? I mean, I have Natural Cure Starmie, but that runs the risk of Pursuit or just getting HP grassed by offensive sets. So, and it's just such a pain to switch into. I mean, Blissey, similar deal. Waters aren't exactly fitting in Refresh, and Heatran destroys them if it wants anyway. Thanks to, you know, its huge special attack and boom and coverage and Earth Power. And, you know, and you can't exactly absorb Heatran burn. I mean, okay, so a lot of Heatran do not run Earth Power, and thus some teams do wind up throughout the course of a game using their Heatran to absorb the other team's Heatran. But it's not something you rely on in team building. I mean, maybe if you're getting down to the intricacies, but most of the time, it's not, oh, well, Heatran's going to be my Heatran counter on this team. It's going to be, oh, my opponent's Heatran does not have Earth Power, so I can use Heatran to protect my team from Lava Plume or Will-O-Wisp burns. But most of the time, your Heatran is going to be a pivot. You know, get in on that fire move and then get out on the earth power. And obviously there's a lot of mind games that go into that on both sides, but that's why burn is tough. And now with Clefable, then you have this incredible Pokemon that switches into Heatran well. Not perfectly, of course, like a Specs or just a very offensive Heatran can really destroy it. But you have a great... You can switch into Lava Plume, you can switch into Will-O-Wisp. If it booms, it booms. I mean, it can boom on anything. But now, with Clef, you have a perfect burn absorber from the most annoying burn distributing Pokemon in the tier. So that's a big one. And Clef can do it. I mean, there's a trick on... sometimes Scarf Rotom runs Will-O-Wisp as well. But Rotom is the other big Will-O-Wisp user. So, it doesn't always run Thunderbolt. It can run like Shadow Ball, Wisp, Rest Talk, which is a set I love. But most of the time, it's going to be T-Bolt. Offensive or defensive set alike. So we'll just include it. So yeah, that's Wisp Rotom for you, and it's pretty hard to switch into Rotom without Heatran. And if you over-rely on Heatran to switch into Rotoms, then they are going to start running things like Choice Specs with Hydro Pump, with Wash Rotom, obviously. But even just if if especially defensive Heatran, if the Heatran is especially defensive, rather, then it will switch into Rotoms all day. That is part of why it became popular and why it was good in the first place. But you can't use it as just a blanket electric resist, because Rotom can definitely turn the tables. I mean, it's even used HP Ground before. But yeah, other than that, the Will-O-Wisp remains the same incredibly spammable move. The reason why Will-O-Wisp Rotom, I mean, it's a pain, but it's definitely a lot less oppressive than Heatran, because it doesn't have that meaty fire stab, in addition to moves like Taunt and Explosion. So, I mean, yes, you can run Will-O-Wisp and Overheat if you want, but for the most part, you're not doing that. So, things like Roserade are really good against most Rotoms. And T-Tar always threatens to pursue it, running things like Lum. Lum T-Tar is good in general, I mean, to help deal with Heatran as well. And there's things like Poison Heal Breloom can help in the same vein as Roserade and Blissey. But it generally, even though there are more options to deal with Will-O-Wisping Rotom, that's still not to say that it's not an enormous pain. I mean, Heatran being so popular and good, and then you have Clef and Rose and Loom and, you know, Lumberries, so it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is still a really obnoxious Pokemon to switch into. Because it's not, again, it's not just a Will-O-Wisp machine. It's got a bevy of tools at its disposal to mess up whatever might want to switch in, depending on what its user might want to do. So, yeah, people are often forced to take burns with less than ideal Pokemon. You know, back when Defensive Roar Swampert was popular, then it was one of the go-to burn quote-unquote absorbers, simply because it could still do damage with Roar. And that's a credit to the move Roar as well, but I mean, you still wouldn't want your Pert burned. It's just because you don't have many better options. So yeah, Will-O-Wisp Rotom's still amazing, whether it's running Subsplit or Rest Talk or Scarf or just a utility set with like Stab or Secondary Stab or HP Ice or whatever. Colbur, Lum, or not Lum, Colbur Lefties. Yeah, boosting items, so whether it's Life Orb on Subsplit, well, generally that runs Will-O-Wisp less, but something like Magnet instead is more appropriate. So, yeah, Wisp Rotom is good. And finally, we have Will-O-Wisp Gengar. Sometimes I catch myself as I'm talking, and I'm like, that is way too fast. But yeah, Gengar used to pretty much never run Will-O-Wisp in DPP. Then in 2012, I mean, I'm sure someone like tried on Ladder and stuff, but it was not used as a high-level play. And Gengar had a million sets, you know, Sub, Boom, whatever. At the end of Gen 4's time as a current gen, then Subsplit was everywhere and remained the default set for years after. In 2012, 6A9 Ace Matador used Will-O-Wisp with Taunt to deal with Vaporeon, which was still very popular then. And it didn't catch on, though, as a standard set. But over time, people realized, hey, you know, Jirachi and Bronzong and even like Spadef Hippo and Milotic are good answers to Gengar, so we're going to use more of them. And then Gengar was like, oh, well, I have Will-O-Wisp, and that ruins everything. And the dominance of Jirachi in particular has made, you know, those classic Gengars with Subsplit and like all-out Life Orb with Boom, they're pretty much gone, because otherwise they're just going to be permanently walled by bulky Jirachis, which is not something you want. And with Will-O-Wisp, you go from being permanently walled by bulky Jirachis to hoping and praying that Jirachi will switch in on you. You would love nothing more than for it to switch in and get burned. So, that's Wisp. And it's really, whether it's Taunt or Boom Blast, usually it's with Black Sludge because longevity. but you can run other items as well. Custap is pretty underrated. Life Orb still works, just so you can run Life Orb Gengar and still be able to burn Jirachi if it shows up. That's a great combination. Taunt, generally popular, but Boom is Taunt or Boom, generally. So yeah, Willows Gengar made itself even more difficult to counter. Wide Lens is an underrated item on this Gengar, by the way, because, hey, more accurate Focus Blast and pretty accurate Will-O-Wisp. Really nice. You can even maybe take your chance on Hypnosis in the last slot. Anyway, so Will-O-Wisp makes Gengar even more obscene to counter, and unlike Rotom, well, Rotom has to trick to get through, or to do anything to Clef, and it still struggles to break through Heatran most of the time. Even like Spadef sets even take Scarf Hydro Pumps pretty easily. You wouldn't want to take them all day, but it can take them pretty easily. But with Gengar, you have a Focus Blast that rips through Heatran, rips through Clefable, rips through Lum Tyranitar. So Will-O-Wisp Gengar is one of the most spammable Pokemon, again, because players have to risk so much just to pivot around it. They'll do like Clef into Will-O-Wisp and then Scarf Rotom on Focus Blast. Both those moves are really risky. Now, obviously, they're hard for Gengar to pull the trigger, but it's still, I mean, a very spammable move, very difficult to switch into. And yeah, so Wisp once again on Gengar, it's kind of a late bloomer, but well, Gengar itself was always amazing, but Wisp was a late addition to its arsenal. But once it took off, it really hasn't gone back. So yeah, Wisp, Gengar, defining good. So, and that's pretty much it for Burn in Gen 4. So again, not a ton of absorbers. I mean, Heatran, good. Restock Rotom, yeah, Restock Rotom only absorbs burns from other Restock Rotom that don't have Shadow Ball at that. So yeah, kind of a pain. It's generally more about using pivots and maybe Taunt if you can help it. But yeah, that's a classic scenario when you have your Taunt Gliscor and the one turn you don't taunt the Restock Rotom because you think it's going to predict it is when it stays in Will-O-Wisp you. So be careful in that. But yeah, that's led to an increase of Refresh, just like in Advance when Will-O-Wisp Gengar being everywhere led to more Refresh Perts and Refresh Milos, which we already alluded to. But we've even seen offensive Refresh Pert from a couple players, excuse me, like Waterfall, EQ, Ice Punch. Suddenly, instead of getting burned and ruined permanently by Heatrans and Rotoms, then the offensive Swampert just refreshes them off and keeps on trucking. So yeah, and you know, Starmie is not keen on switching into Absorb Will-O-Wisps from Rotom and Gengar. So yeah, Burn really good in Gen 4. So, still not some great Flame Body action. I mean, unless you really want to use Magmortar, which I mean, it's cool, but just not really plausible. So Gen 5, Heatran is still Heatran, and from day one, it said like I'm gonna do the exact same thing I did before. It never had Flame Body released, sadly, but same old Heatran. Rotom changed because Rotom Wash is now the dominant form because it's now Electric and Water, whereas before all forms were Electric and Ghost. They had their different signature moves, but they had the same typing. So now Electric Water Rotom. So the biggest change about Burn in Gen 5 is that now Burn comes from Water types. Previously, it was annoying when it came from Gengar because it wasn't like you counter a Fire type. It had a Fire, status option, but it wasn't a Fire type. So you could handle you can handle Will-O-Wisping Moltres or Heatran with a refreshing or resting Milotic or something. But now the Fire absorbing options, basically Heatran, you can't really absorb Will-O-Wisp or you can't really absorb burns from Water types because it's a Fire type switching into a Water type. And obviously there are some exceptions like Spadef Heatran, and now that Gliscor has Poison Heal and that starts running Spadef, then sometimes that, especially in Gen 6, then they can kind of absorb weaker Scalds, especially from the likes of things like a Lomomola, which just exists to fish for burns. But generally the idea is that the burn absorbing options are not switching into Wisp, and it defined Gen 5 pretty much from the get-go. And you don't have Clefable's too weak to keep up with this tier, so you don't have that Magic Guard option. Reuniclus is a great Magic Guard Pokemon, and in a nutshell, it does take on, the burning pokes, but Rotom Volt switches into T-Tar and Pursuit, Jellicent taunts it, and Reuniclus does not really it needs to run defense on a Calm Mindset, and it does not have the Spadef to take a bunch of boosted water moves over and over. especially because it's forced to recover, and that leaves it more exploitable. So, yeah, in a nutshell, it is good, but the options are not great for dealing with burns and when they're coming from water types, and Gen 5 perfectly exemplifies that, especially because those water types are boosted by permanent rain a lot of the time. So, what do? Well, Poison Heal Breloom became popular because it was able to stop Willows being Rotom. Natural Cure Celebi has fluctuated in and out of popularity because of Natural Cure and resisting Rotom stabs. And besides that, you don't really have much. I mean, a lot of people absorb Burn with Latios, not because it's a good burn absorber, but because it's the least terrible burn absorber. I mean, things like Taunt, Wisp, Mew, and Sableye were popular for a while, but in general, the options are... it's toughest to absorb the burns from Heatrans, because Heatran can hit Heatran hard and burn everything else, you know, especially when it runs like HP Ice for Gliscors. Or just, you know, more offensive variants with Magma Storms and Overheats can overpower it. Because if it's Spadef, then it'll be outrun, so 2 KO on the switch. But yeah, the water types distributing burn is revolutionary and a huge, huge deal. Especially because, well, what, did every water get Will-O-Wisp? Nope. They got Scald, a water type Lava Plume. So now it's not even like you're choosing to go for Will-O-Wisp, you're just spamming a water move, probably absorbed by rain, and you might just get a burn on top of that. So that whole thing about, oh, Ferrothorn's going to wall everything in existence, yeah, never mind, because all the water types can burn now. Now, I don't think Ferrothorn would be broken if water types didn't have Scald, because that would be ridiculous. If the only way to keep Ferrothorn in check was to hope that you could burn it with Scald, then it would need to be banned. But, nevertheless, matter of fact, the black and white landscape has changed so much that players now expect to get their Ferrothorn burned. So entire game plans with Rotom and Excadrill revolved around burning. There's no, like, if you have a team with Ferrothorn, you are not going to have a better option to handle a Rotom burn. So you just accept it, you just take it, and you start getting up your hazards. That's the basic idea. And then Rotom teams, once Excadrill started being explored as a serious option, they would burn the Ferrothorn, and then Excadrill would spin on Ferrothorn all day long. And then, in response, Ferrothorn says, okay, well, if Rotom's just going to turn one burn me, I'm going to run Lumberry and Adamant and a lot of attack, and I'm just going to power up and KO it on the first turn. So, Ferrothorn's relationship, and that also helps with, like, the endless Scalds of Politoads and Tentacruels and Jellicents and stuff. And with how readily players play with a burn Ferrothorn, then, you know, they certainly won't mind it not having lefties, because it's effectively the same thing, except you get to KO Rotoms and, you know, smack other waters real hard for free. So, you know, have a lot more leeway. So, yeah, Ferrothorn's had a very complex relationship to burn. Obviously, it likes burns being distributed on the other side, on the other team, because that makes its spikes and its knockoffs, you know, formerly Leech Seeds before that became less popular. That's another video, why Leech Seed fell out of favor on Ferrothorn. Yeah, why, so they help amplify all that passive damage it's dishing out. But it's like Latios in that it's often used as a default burn absorber. Not because it's an ideal burn absorber. You know, with Natural Cure, you know, you still take burn damage, but you still are a lot less hampered by it than a Pokemon that just says, okay, well, guess I'm burned now. And yeah, things like Guts Conkeldurr not really gonna work, because again, rain boosted and not a lot of longevity, so... I mean, Latios at least has Recover, which is not, you know, perfect, but it's something. So... yes, so that's, oh, Jellicent is also important because with Water Absorb, it is able to withstand Scalds all day. Never risks a burn. Problem is, those Scalding waters, those Scald-only waters, you know, Politoed and Tentacruel, they don't have Will-O-Wisp like Jellicent does, so Jellicent and Rotom are similar in how they distribute burns, in that they have Water Stab and Will-O-Wisp. And Jellicent, of course, has other great stuff like Recover and Taunt, but yeah. But Politoed and Tentacruel, they usually ran Toxic. So, you know, you can't absorb it with Jellicent, or something like Gastrodon, which also runs Scald itself. You could say, oh yeah, Water Absorb pokes, just deal with it that way. Yeah, and then they Toxic your Jellicent or Gastrodon, and yikes. Now, not that that's necessarily a death sentence, you can play with it, but it's still, you know, far from the perfect counter you would hope your Water Absorb Pokemon would be to Scald. So yeah, I have a particularly deep hatred for this move. But that's, again, another video. So yeah, well, and Politoed started running Refresh, again, to help with all the Wisp Wars. Pretty crazy stuff. Oh, and when Sun was very popular in the tier, the Ninetales ran Will-O-Wisp as well on pretty much every set. So yeah, Burn has always been a central part of Generation 5's identity. Not necessarily just with Scald, but you know, in so many ways. So yeah, it's pretty infuriating when you have that physical attacker that would destroy them, but they get bailed out by the Burn. It's too powerful a move for what it is, I think. For its coverage, I guess. If it was like a bug-type Scald, well, that doesn't have immunities. Now, see, yeah, it's just a dumb move. At least with Heatran, then, if you are going to lose because Heatran burned you with Lava Plume, you would lose that anyway because it also gets Will-O-Wisp, and it is a Fire type. Now, Rotom Wash is, you know, annoying as well. This is why Poison Heal, Breloom, and Celebi were... Not Poison Heal Celebi, just regular Celebi were popular for a time because they could absorb all the Scalds and Toxics and, you know, water Will-O-Wisps. But, yeah, it's still tough to be fully status absorbent. A lot of time you just gotta deal. I mean, yeah, you have those combinations of, like, Celebi and then Heatran and Gliscor and Reuniclus, and they are pretty status absorbent, but those also make for some pretty bulky teams. And Scald is even so good that, while this was not a standard on Keldeo until relatively recently, considering Black and White's overall lifespan, then it even used Scald because suddenly you try to check it with something like a Slowking, and whoops, you got burned, and you have Protect, or Latios even. And with Scald, then you go on the offensive. That's why Scald is so tough. Like, in Gen 3, when we mentioned Willows Gengar not being overbearing, you know, it's not like Will-O-Wisp was an outright damaging move, whereas Scald is. And that's what makes it so terrifying, even on defensive Pokemon, like Politoed and Tentacruel, who are weak. But on Keldeo, who's fast and strong, you're going on the offensive and burning your checks at the same time? Oh my god. And you think, oh, well, burn's not that bad. Well, remember, passive damage. Like, if you had an Amoonguss, one of the safest counters possible. Okay, well, it's Rocks and Sand. Oh, that's not so bad. Oh, well, Scald Burn? Well, still not so bad, especially with Regenerator and Giga Drain. Okay, Keldeo protects, another round of passive damage, and switches out. Now you have to come back and do it again. It really racks up really nastily, and Keldeo isn't obligated to run Toxic in the last slot, but it often did when DICE first created this set. So, yeah, Scald, nasty. Burn, nasty. Everywhere you can find... Any Pokemon that can burn generally will take the chance to use it at this point. Whenever Sun occasionally pops up, then Ninetales will run it, so... Yeah, bulky Starmie used to be very popular, and its entire viability hinged on, once you burn the Ferrothorn, it's great. Rainstorm can't handle it. You know, big if, but you spam Scald so much, then yeah. Toxic Rogue was also, you know, valuable because it blanks both Scald and Toxic, which is very nice, but you're not totally out of the woods against Water's distributing burns because it doesn't switch into Jellicent or Rotom. So, and it only fits into some Rain teams. So, yeah, Burn, pretty big deal. I mean, oh, you got a new Fire type in Volcarona, but, oh yeah, there's the fact that Heatran walls it most of the time, and it has a big Stealth Rock weakness, so even if it is a Heatran set that you can somehow beat, then you're not switching in on it, or, you know, much anything. Oh, and the fact that most of the Pokemon distributing the burns are, in fact, waters, and many of them are often boosted by rain. So, these are not even, I mean, there's even been stuff like Rain Vaporeon, which... Whew, massive pain. So, yeah, there was something else I wanted to say about this, I think. No, no. Oh, there was stuff like Mew and Sableye before, but at least those were more manageable with combinations of like Heatran and Gliscor. But yeah, even those guys could be massively annoying because Burn is just incredible. And finally, we go on to Gen 6. So Heatran, same old Heatran. Rotom, same old Rotom. It runs physical defense now instead of special because it's taking physical attackers on instead of special rain-boosted Hydros and stuff, but same basic idea. You got a new Fire... Now, what was nice about Gen 6 at first was that you thought, oh, well, we have a lot more good burn absorbers now. And that's very true, because you have Talonflame, which is a burn distributor itself, but also a potential burn absorber. You have two more Fire types in Charizard Mega X and Charizard Mega Y. You have a renewed Clefable with Fairy typing, so it answers a lot more and is newly threatening. You even have things like Magic Bounce, well, Sableye sometimes, for Will-O-Wisp at least, not Scald and Lava Plume, but hey, you're trying to get whatever you can get. Diancie and Sableye, when it was allowed in the tier, still Diancie. You know, they're good options for that, great options for that. I mean, risky, but still something. And Diancie totally, like, blanks a lot of Talonflame. So, Heatran's still great. So you have more options than ever. And even with no longer having to contend with permanent rain, then Gliscor becomes better. Hydro Pump loses power, so Spadef Gliscor can stall bulky Rotom a lot more easily. It can answer a lot of Heatrans, things like that. Then, yeah, you have more Burn absorbers than ever before. But Burn did not lose a beat. Not only is Heatran as good as ever with its Lava Plume shenanigans, Rotom's as good as ever. I mean, the whole thing, harkening back to Gen 3, that when you are forced to rely on the burn answer, then it's very exploitable. What do you do to prevent yourself from being afflicted by a Rotom burn? You go to Clef. It Volt Switches. And now something else comes in. You take Chip, you get forced out by the Mega Metagross or whatever. And when Clef is also forced to deal with something like knockoff Tornadus, and then it gets U-turned on and Volt Switched, and it can very easily be overwhelmed by the fact that it's relied on to take burns. Your Heatran can be attacked similarly. Now, Talonflame is harder to fit, but same idea. And even with the increase of a defog, so things like Talonflame and Roost Volcarona are more popular and viable, then it's still a far cry, especially because not just Rotom Hydro Pump. I mean, Rotom's Hydro Pump was weakened, but because Scald is everywhere. Now, you still see it as a defensive staple in things like Slowbro, Mega Slowbro, and Alomomola. CTC even used to use Assault Vest Azumarill with Scald as the 4th move because, oh, what's that? Your Scizor perfectly counters Azumarill? Oh, there it goes. But the purest example of Scald as an overwhelming offensive weapon was, I mean, we already mentioned Keldeo, but in Gen 6, Surf had its power nerf, so it's like, well, I'm definitely going to use Scald now. And all those awesome burn absorbing options, yeah, they don't really work against Keldeo. I mean, feel free to switch your Charizards or your, Heatran or your Gliscor into Specs Keldeo. I'm sure the Keldeo user would really appreciate it. Yeah, and the other options, I mean, the water absorbers are, I mean, Jellicent became popular just because of how oppressive Scald was. But, I mean, even that can be HP Grass, and, you know, Amoonguss gets worn. Even without permanent sand or permanent rain, Scald Keldeo, Spec Scald Keldeo is the most spammable attack in the tier, or at least one of them. And just destroys everything. I mean, Amoonguss gets worn down. I mean, yes, it's chance, but that's the whole thing. It's chance. Removing player interactivity. I mean, Clefable is a great Scald absorber now that Rain is no longer around, so it can withstand things like bulky Starmie all day, and I mean, Suicune making a comeback with renewed sleep mechanics was definitely a help in Gen 5. Even that was when Rest Talk was completely knocked out of the game in Gen 5. That was kind of a hit for why Burn was so nasty as well. And in Gen 6, then Suicune kind of came back, and that helped for a while. But, I mean, Suicune's still not a good Keldeo answer because it has stab fighting moves, and Scald just burns everything. And even if you don't beat that switch in immediately, just burning it ruins it. It's best put like Heist once said, it rewards the safe move. That's why it's so good and so spammable. And when you have Keldeo against Heatran, and you know they have an Amoonguss, you spam Scald. If Heatran stays in, down it goes. If Amoonguss comes in, you still probably burn it, and you just go fishing all game. It's a super powerful fishing tool, and that's what Burn became. It wasn't just a Scald spamming with Keldeo, obviously, but the other options for dealing with Scald were much more manageable, like switching Clefable into just do a pivot around Slowbro or Suicune or Starmie or a Mola, or, you know, even pivoting around with Gliscor or Heatran, not nearly as bad. But with Keldeo throws all out the window and mows through everything. So it was the most definitive. Manaphy used Scald as well, but eventually started using Surf because extra power was big when trying to grab Okos with +3 Tail Glow. But yeah, that was Burn. And even eventually got a super-powered Scald option in Steam Eruption Volcanion. Now, Volcanion is quite a good Pokemon in Oris, and most people would consider it as such, but it's still underrated. Now, it's obviously held back from spamming Steam Eruption all game because, unlike Keldeo, it is Stealth Rock weak as opposed to resistant, and it's not as fast. It's weak to ground, weak to EQ is not great, but it's very powerful, you know, just as, or even slightly stronger than Keldeo, and it can afford to run Modest, so effectively a lot stronger. If it runs Choice Specs, it can run Leftovers, it's got great physical bulk. it can actually act as a pretty decent, not Mega Metagross answer, but like interim measure. But yeah, it distributes those. If you thought Scald was bad before, Steam Eruption is 110 power, so it's basically basically Fire Blast. So, and it often runs Toxic, so good luck with your Jellicent. So yeah, Steam Eruption's power, and it's the same as Specs Keldeo. Clefable commonly runs enough Spadef EVs to not be 2 KO'd by Keldeo Spec Scald, which, number 1, requires a lot of bulk, number 2, requires a lot of Clefable to be at high health, and often requires Clefable to stay away from knockoff, and sometimes it's hard to not let Clefable eat a knockoff because Torn is hard to switch into. So, a lot of ifs. Now, Clefable still does the job pretty well, just to make sure that other Pokemon don't get ripped apart, but, I mean, it's tough, and Volcanion just really amps that up. Spec Steam Eruption, or just regular Steam Eruption, are massively powerful. Clef doesn't want to switch into it. And matter of fact, one of my favorite things to do on non-Specs Volcanion, if you're running lefties, then you run Sludge Wave, and you really rip through Clef that thinks it's cute. So, yeah, that is that. So, yeah, that's Volcanion, and it is not as dangerous as Keldeo because of its aforementioned flaws, but it's fundamentally just as scary to switch into. So that's Burn for you. I believe that is it. We're not going to mention Gen 7 or 8 because I don't really do Gen 8, but I imagine Heatran is as annoying as ever. There's no Poison Eel Gliscor. I mean, I think I see it run Heavy Slam and stuff. And in Gen 7, then, I mean, there are good options against Burn in Tapu Fini, Misty Terrain, but it also uses Scald itself. And then, of course, there's the nerfing of Burn to 6.25, which was a good change. I definitely like that change. But it also brought Toxapex. So, yeah, and that's where I'm going to check out. So, thank you guys very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope this was useful or informative or enjoyable in whatever way. So, thank you guys very much for watching, and I will catch you all next time.